Hey folks, I'm John Lee and welcome back to my channel, and if you're new, welcome. Okay, so if you're one of those people who don't really focus all that much on East Asian politics or geopolitics or military affairs or what have you, you might not really know all that much about the Korean Peninsula. If you hear the words Korea and military in a given sentence, say on Fox News or MSNBC or CNN, you're most likely going to hear about North Korea. And for good reason. The North Koreans have spent a lot of money and a lot of time to build up their nuclear weapons. And so that's what you're most likely going to hear about. If you do hear the word army in South Korea, you're mostly going to think of BTS. And for good reason too. But a lot of people kind of miss an important point in that sense that, yes, Korea is arming itself heavily, and it's not just the North Koreans, it's also South Korea, and with a lot of high-tech weapons too. And the question is, why? Now, the fact that South Korea has a lot of modern-day battle tanks and howitzers probably won't surprise anyone. After all, the Korean Peninsula has been divided for more than 70 years, and although the North Koreans don't really have all that much high-tech weapons, they make up for it with numbers and a whole lot of WMDs. That doesn't really surprise anyone, but people start to take notice when the weapons that South Korea acquires starts to become less defensive and could be interpreted to be more offensive. Now, for example, over the past few years, South Korea has acquired a whole fleet of stealth fighters. And South Korea is also starting to build its own domestic stealth fighter program. And this is the kind of weapons that kind of make other countries a little bit nervous. Another thing that the South Koreans have been doing is acquiring medium-range ballistic missiles. The Hyunmoo missiles, for example. Now, again, ballistic missiles are something that make a lot of people quite nervous. And recently, I believe this happened just last year, actually, the United States and South Korea reached an agreement that allowed South Korea to increase its missile payload and distance. And again, this kind of makes other countries like Japan and China a little bit wary of where South Korea is headed. Also, according to local news sources, the South Korean government wants to build its own light aircraft carrier by 2033. And speaking of naval units, the South Korean government over the past few years has been wanting to acquire nuclear submarines as well, but not so much luck there. Nuclear fuel tends to be a bit of a sensitive subject. So these are all really impressive weapons that rightfully make a lot of people nervous. So the question is, why is South Korea acquiring all of these new gadgets? After all, South Korea is a treaty ally with the United States. With this huge alliance, the South Koreans really don't need to worry about external aggression all that much. So why is South Korea going on a huge shopping spree for all of these high-tech weapons? Well, there are a few reasons, some of them more compelling than others. Now, the reasons that I'm going to provide you with are in no particular order, and they are by no means exhaustive, so take that as you will. Now, reason number one is, of course, Japan. Now, Japan and Korea have never really had much of a close relationship, and this lack of cordiality goes back centuries. And we also have to remember that back in the 20th century, for quite a number of decades, the Japanese had occupied the entire Korean peninsula. And so a lot of Koreans still have a lot of sore memories about that. And so why are we bringing this up? That's because that's probably one of the reasons why South Korea wants to acquire its own aircraft carrier. Now, the Japanese Navy, which is called the Maritime Self-Defense Forces, does not have an aircraft carrier. The Japanese Navy has not had an aircraft carrier since 1945. But that's just a technical issue. They don't call it an aircraft carrier. The Maritime Self-Defense Forces call what they have a helicopter destroyer, and it looks like this. Who are they trying to fool? And so, because Japan has such a powerful weapon, I'm pretty sure that's one of the reasons as to why South Korea wants to have its own light aircraft carrier as well. Reason number two is actually the United States. Now, South Korea and the United States have been allies for decades now, and they've had a very close working relationship. But there have been quite a little bit of rumbling going on over the past few decades as well. It's not been all smooth sailing. And one of the leading causes of this rumbling is what is known as Opcon Transfer. Opcon being the abbreviation for Operational Control Authority. Now, what Opcon really says is that if a war were to break out between the two Koreas ever again, the United States would be treaty bound to come to help South Korea. But, according to this agreement that was signed decades ago, should a war break out, the South Korean military would fall under the command of the United States. Now, it made a lot of sense when this agreement was made back in the day. That's because the United States was then, as it is still now, a superpower, and South Korea was a basket case. But South Korea is not a basket case anymore. And so, Ever since the 1990s, the South Korean government has tried to have these Opcon Transfer negotiations with the United States so that the South Korean government would be able to retake wartime operational control. So that means that if a war were to break out again, the United States forces who are stationed in South Korea would fall under the South Korean military's control. And this kind of leads to a little bit of a sensitive issue here. Now, for South Korea, Opcon Transfer is not just about politics, it's also about our national identity. We want to show to the whole world that South Korea is not a colony or a dependent of the United States. We want to show that South Korea is a strong, powerful, and independent country, and that we are able to take charge of our own destiny. And so Opcon Transfer is quite important to South Korea. So if it's that important, why hasn't Opcon Transfer actually happened yet? Well, that's because of the really complex nature of inter-Korean politics that has existed over the past few decades. Now, although the United States and South Korea have talked numerous times about Opcon transfers, sometimes the relationship between North and South Korea can be good, sometimes it can be bad. And when the relations are bad, yeah, we tend to want to make sure that things don't really change all that much, because change kind of rocks the boat, so to speak. And especially during times of crisis, we don't want there to be a lot of rocking going on. Now, as for the United States, it's a little bit of a mixed bag. There are some people who are supportive of this Opcon transfer, and there are those who are not all that supportive. And those who are not supportive of operational control transfers is a little understandable. Why would an American general want to relinquish command of his troops to a South Korean general? No superpower would ever do that. And so, if a war were to break out, the United States generals don't really trust the South Koreans to have their soldiers' best interest at heart. But this is just one aspect of the problem that exists between South Korea and the United States. A much more fundamental problem that exists is that this alliance, or at least the alliance in its current form, can't be expected to exist perpetually. Currently, 28,000 American troops are stationed in South Korea. There used to be a lot more, but there are now 28,000. And the eventual goal is to ensure that someday no American soldier is still remaining in South Korea. This is not going to last forever. Someday, for one reason or another, the United States is going to withdraw all of its troops from South Korea. Trump tried to do it, Jimmy Carter tried to do it, and someday it's going to happen. And when American forces are no longer stationed in South Korea will become a much more vulnerable target than it is right now. Right now, South Korea is quite safe from a lot of external threats, even from North Korea, because if a war broke out, as I said earlier, the United States would be treaty bound to come to South Korea's aid, and who would ever want to mess with the United States? But without American troops present, yes, the treaty, unless it is also altered, will not all that change, and America would still come to South Korea's aid, but perhaps not to the extent that it would if South Korea was still hosting 28,000 American soldiers. So it is not completely unfair to say that one of the reasons that the South Korean government is acquiring all of these high-tech weapons is that South Korea is looking ahead into a future, and more specifically into a possible future where American forces are no longer as invested in protecting South Korea as they are right now. And of course, the third reason is this guy, but not for the reason that you think. Now, if you're one of those casual news consumers and you don't really know all that much about Korean politics or what have you, you might have heard, especially those talking heads on Fox News or anyone else on those cable news channels, who say things like Kim Jong-un is a madman, that North Korea is unpredictable.
President Trump returning triumphantly from Singapore. President Trump has now accomplished what no other American president has ever had the vision or the courage to even attempt.
세상 사람들은 세계의 평화와 인류의 미래에 있어서 거대한 역사적 우위를 가지는 뜻깊은 이 날을 맞이할 수 있었습니다.
Only days ago, President Trump ushered in a new era of diplomacy.
세계적 사변을 이룩하신 경야는 최고領導者 동지께서는
This is something that many analysts and pundits thought was totally impossible.
그 누가 상상할 수 있었겠습니까?
If you believe that Kim Jong-un is actually a madman or that North Korea is unpredictable, I would like to ask you to disabuse yourself of that notion, because Kim Jong-un is not insane and North Korea is not unpredictable. In fact, they are the most sane and predictable groups of people out there in the world right now. North Korea has no intention of starting a war. If North Korea starts a war, even if they use their nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction, North Korea would cease to exist. South Korea, again, I'm repeating, is a treaty ally of the United States. The United States would come to South Korea's aid, and if North Korea started a war, that would be the end of North Korea. So Kim Jong-un has no desire whatsoever to start a war. And so then why is Kim Jong-un a reason that South Korea is developing all of these weapons when Kim Jong-un probably doesn't want to start a war? And that's because even if Kim Jong-un doesn't want to start a war, he could probably die. Now, North Korea is not your average communist country. No other communist country on earth, not even under Stalin, not even under Mao Zedong, has there ever been a communist country that had a cultish, hereditary Stalinist regime. North Korea is the only one that has that. And right now, if Kim Jong-un were to die, it's not really clear as to who would succeed him. Kim Jong-un has very young children who are not yet even teenagers or even tweens, I imagine. And because Kim Jong-un's children are so young, his children probably won't be able to take over if he should die, say, today. Now, some people do point out that should Kim Jong-un just, die today, his sister would be able to take over. But I'm not convinced if his sister, Kim Yo-jong, would be able to do so. Now, a lot of people say that Kim Yo-jong has been promoted over the years. She's become a much more prolific public figure. But I'm not sure if she's actually able to take over the top job. Now, Kim Jong-un had killed his half-brother, Kim Jong-nam, while he was in an airport in Kuala Lumpur, and another one of his half-brothers is on the run. So why are all of his other siblings being killed, but not her? And I believe that the reason for that is because all those other siblings are men, and Kim Yo-jong is a woman. And I think Kim Yo-jong is being promoted and is being coddled, not because Kim Jong-un actually believes that she's capable, but more because he doesn't really think that she's a threat. Because, she's a woman. I'm not saying this because I'm sexist. I'm saying that the North Koreans are sexist, and that's what they probably believe. And we have to admit that this is not an unrealistic possibility. Now, I don't want to fat shame. As you can see, I'm not exactly in the best shape as well, but Kim Jong-un is not exactly the healthiest guy out there. He's just one prime rib away from getting a heart attack. And if he dies, all hell could break loose. And that's why, although a lot of arms control experts are wondering why South Korea wants to acquire so many of these high-tech weapons that are making a lot of people nervous, South Korea is acquiring these weapons because we'd feel a lot more nervous if we didn't have these weapons. And that's why South Korea is acquiring so many of these high-tech weapons that a lot of people are kind of scratching their heads over. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this video. If you like this content, don't forget to click on the like and subscribe button. Don't forget to click on the notification bell. And if you have a comment, leave it down below. I'd love to read them. I'm John Lee, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.